Hey, welcome. I'm Brian. This is Watch Complications. This video is a continuation of my Monty Python custom project, building a watch based on dial and hands that I got out of the original watch. If you haven't watched part one, I recommend you go back and do that. It'll give you context for one, the project, what the original watch looked like, and what it looked like taking it apart. And so what I'm going to do in this video is walk you through all the selected components, the case, the movement, what I had to create for the spacer and holder inside, and stem issues, all that kind of stuff. So that's what this video is about. I'll throw in some teaser photos to show you what this is starting to look like, and I'll also give you a little highlight video as well, what this thing is starting to look like as it's coming together. But really, we just want to walk through each of the issues I had to contend with in getting all the components together and sorted for this build. And then part three coming up not long after this, we're going to walk through the process of then putting it all together. I don't know who's not into Monty Python, but if you're into Monty Python or find it fun and you're also a watch enthusiast, then this is right up your alley, or ministry. I want to give a hint of what this thing's going to look like when it's done, even though it's not completely done yet. But I want to have that visual for you all so you can see where I'm going with this mod. The case I decided on for this project is a black PVD. I'll give more details about it in different parts of the video or series. It's about 41.5 millimeter diameter, so it's good size. It does have an exhibition back. I liked that it didn't have any writing or details on it. It's one of the reasons I chose it. But this is what it's going to generally look like. I've got the dial upside down at the moment, so don't worry about that, and still have the stickers on it. But this gives you a sense of at least where I'm going with the project. It's got my Miyota 6T33 hand wound movement in there, and a lot of custom stuff going on inside to make this work, which is always the case when you're trying to fit a movement to a case that wasn't intended for. This case was meant for a Miyota 8215 movement, but that gives you an idea of what this thing is going to look like when I'm done with it. Get a nice strap, and it's going to be a fun little watch. All right, so let me issue a reminder. The case that came with this watch is not good at all. It's a blasted look, but it's plated brass. It's got a snap-on case back. Although I do like the writing and stuff on the back of this, like for best use the other side. It's just not a good case. You can see the crown is originally at 4 o'clock, and you can see the movement holder in there from the original Quartz movement that was in the watch. So not a good case or a good strap, very light, and just not a good look overall. I thought, well, what color case would look good? And I considered some stainless steel cases. I thought about using this bronze case, and so I got it and tried it out. I figured that the dial size was going to be a little issue. The dial's a little bit too big, and I probably would have had to shave off more of the dial than I wanted to. Finding a case that will fit the exact dial size, and if I recall, it's just 34.5, can be an issue sometimes. But I thought it would look good in the bronze, and it would, but this one just wasn't going to work because the dial needed more shaved off than I was comfortable with. So I landed on a really only option out there that I could find, at least to buy a case for it on the open market and not get something custom made, was this black PVD case. Now it's a stainless steel intended for the Miyota 8215. It's 5 ATM, which is certainly going to be a little bit more protective than the original case was. They had this with both sapphire and mineral, but the sapphire is sold out. It's been sold out for a long time, so I went with the only option. It was mineral. Now I could change out the crystal at some point if I wanted to, if it ends up getting scratched up. I prefer sapphire or acrylic, to be honest, because at least with acrylic you can use polywash and get all scratches out of mineral. You're just kind of stuck. So if I wanted to take the modification even further, and I might say more about this at another point, I could change out the crystal. It wouldn't be difficult to get a crystal that will fit this and pop the mineral one out and put the sapphire one in. Here's the movement holder that came with that case. This is again intended for a Miyota 8215, which is not the movement I was going to use because the hand sizes wouldn't have been correct. The case back didn't have writing on it, which I really liked and appreciated. For example, like on the bronze one, this was a solid case back. I maybe would have preferred a solid case back on this watch, but hey, it's a skeletonized movement, so why not show it off a little bit? But this had writing on the back, and one of the things wouldn't have been true. So it says automatic on the back when this is just a hand wound movement that I'm putting in here. And I like the circle look for the case back tool. So the only components that are migrating from the original watch to this are the dial and hands. Everything else is different. In this project, the case is really the first thing that I needed to figure out. Needed a case that would fit the dial. Then I can move on to, okay, I've got the hands. What movement will fit those hands? And then you can get to other things like any spacers or holders that you need on the inside that are custom, stem length because the case is bigger than the original one, things like that. So case came first. The case was intended for a dial diameter of 33.5 to 34.5. Now usually when you're buying a case, it'll have a dial fit range, and it's usually about a millimeter range. So for example, this one was 33.5 to 34.5. That means the dial you want to probably put in it is a 34 millimeter dial, right in the middle of that range. This dial is originally 34.5, so at the very top of what this case's range was. Usually in those circumstances, that means you're going to have to file off just a little bit of the dial around the edge. And that's what I had to do with this dial. As you can see, a little bit of the paint missing right around the edges. That's because I've filed this the whole way around. There's usually an edge around the dial that's hidden by the case because it sits on the edge inside the case. And on this one, the case will go almost to the orange. There's about 2 millimeters of give here. I wouldn't have went for a case where I would have had to file this down into the black part of the paint, and it would have gotten too close to the text, stuff like that. So avoid that kind of situation. I also had dial feet meant for that quartz movement, and so I removed those and filed that down so those were nice and smooth because we're gonna have to put new dial feet on this thing. So now that we have a case and the dial fitting in the case, now we can go about picking a movement that will also fit in the case. And what I've gone with on this project is the Miyota 6T33. I wanted a mechanical movement. I didn't care really that much if it was hand wound or automatic. My preference on this was leaning toward hand wound, and so that's what I ended up going with. Now, this movement is really chosen out of necessity. In the previous part of this video or series, when I took the original watch apart, that was to mostly see, well, what movement's in it. It was a Miyota 2035. That will determine what hand sizes I needed to be looking for on another comparable mechanical movement, because that's one of the components I'm bringing over. That's what makes this watch, is the hour, minute, and seconds hand. This Miyota 6T33 is one of the only movements. I couldn't find another one, and if anybody is familiar with one, please put it in the comments below. Another movement that had the same hand sizes as the Miyota 2035. Speaking of 35, sounds like one of the F-35s just took off. Yeah, the hand sizes on this are 1.2 millimeters for the hour hand, 0.7 millimeter for the minute hand, and 0.17 millimeter for the second hand. I scoured around, and I'm happy this movement shared those hand sizes because I've worked on this movement before. This is the same movement that is in the Vario Empire series, and it gave me some insight into, one, how I'm going to have to modify the dial further, but it's just something that I had laying around anyway. However, this is a discontinued movement. You can't really find spares out there. I bought the last two from Star Time, so I could do future mods if someone else wanted one of these, or if I wanted to make one and give it to a friend or something like that. One of the reasons they discontinued this is they kind of moved toward a new platform with the 8N33, and it has different hand sizes, so that wasn't going to work. So it's a good, basic, simple movement. Has a nice look about it. It does have both the gold looking version and the silver looking version. So there are a couple variants out there of it when it comes to the collar. The ones that I happened to have and that were still in stock at the time when I bought them were the gold ones. Okay, so the three big things figured out: case, dial, movement. How do we put it all together so that it looks good, fits snug, and everything's just sort of interfaced well together? Well, the first step to that is securing the dial to the movement. And of course, I removed the dial feet that were meant for the quartz. So I need to put new dial feet on the dial. And I'm going to show that as part of this series. And I'm also going to spin off a very specific video for just how to properly put new dial feet on a dial when you're again, changing movements or repurposing a dial, that kind of thing, or maybe one's broken and you need to put a new foot back on. So that's just going to be a separate own video, but it's going to be integrated part of this series as well. In the dial mod community, things like dial dots will get mentioned, and I've played around with them just as part of my tinkering and stuff. They can get you by in a pinch, but I would not highly recommend it. It's really sort of the cheap, low-cost way to do it, but there are better ways to go about securing a dial to movement. But there's something specific about this movement that had to be taken into consideration in terms of the modification. If I hold this up close, you can see that there is a yoke that goes over the hour wheel. Usually there'd be like a dial washer or something like that. But you can see there are two screws right here and right here that secure this to the movement. Let's look at this from the side. You can see that it actually sits higher than the main plate. What does that mean for the dial? Well, when that dial is sitting against the movement, it's not against the main plate. It's sitting against that yoke over the hour wheel, and it's kind of an odd shape. It will kind of tilt back and forth. If I was to use dial dots on this and stick it to a couple locations on the movement, even whenever I put the dial on top of that, any little pressure one way or the other would bend it. So I'd have to put the dial dots on the yoke itself, but it's just not a good solution. Let me show you how other people handle this movement when it comes to the dial. And this is where I got an idea from. This is the dial from my Vario Silver Empire. I changed out the dial, did a dial swapping video. So I have two of the dials. So what they've done is they've created a washer, really it's a spacer, that creates a recess for that yoke to sit against the dial while the main plate can sit against this spacer. And you can see that the dial feet are then on this spacer. Well, I need to create something similar. And so that goes into the overall height of the stem and things like that. So a lot of little things with this modification, this build, that are a little quirky. So that's where I got to the next phase of this project. I needed to create a similar spacer. Easy to do with a 3D printer, easy to draw. Just got to get the diameters right and the thickness correct and create a spacer. So I practiced at that. Now I want this to be black on the inside of the case, so I do a lot of my test printing in white because I have a lot more of the white PLA material than the black. So I basically get everything sized right, like this spacer and the movement holder, and then I'll switch over to the black to do the actual final prints. Like so. So here's my spacer. To duplicate that, hit the dial, and we're just going to adhere this spacer to the dial. Again, creating that same recessed effect so that the entire movement, not just one part of it, can sit flush against the dial. Now I'm going to use an epoxy to adhere this plastic to the metal. There's a lot of different types of epoxy, but I'll show all that detail in the next video where I put everything together. Then I've got to put the dial feet on. Again, I'll show that in the next video. I'll use a mill to carve out locations for dial feet, and then again use an epoxy, an adhesive to put dial feet in the correct locations. What's nice is usually you'll have to measure it and be kind of tedious, but I have a template. That's the dial in a nutshell. Had to file it down some. Gonna have to create a custom spacer on the back to adhere to it and put custom dial feet on. Then and only then will I be happy with it being secured to the movement in a correct way. Let's see what this looks like once we start putting it together. So put the dial in, right? Our spacer is going to be in there, right? Movement, we'll just plop in there and get it rotated to the correct location. So that's what it starts to look like. Now, again, this case originally came with a movement holder not intended for this movement, yeah? So, of course, those of you who are familiar with the channel know one of the main things I do in my watchmaking modding and a service I provide for other people. You can check it out on my website if you want to have this done for some project you're doing, is I design in CAD custom movement holders and 3D print them. This is one of the more complex ones that I've done. And it's usually a step-by-step process. First, it's getting the diameter right? And getting the little notches in the correct spot for the case, getting the heights correct so that it meshes well against the case back, any sort of secure points for the movement, getting any gaps correct. So it's a process, but draw it up, a lot of testing, and then eventually you get to where you're going. So there are a couple of things on this movement that I'm using to help keep it as secure and snug as possible. So one, you can see these cutouts. One's down here kind of around 4 o'clock. The other one's over here close to 9 o'clock. There's another one up here about 10 o'clock. So when I'm making a custom holder, I'm looking for things like this on the movement that I can take advantage of, so that, think about whenever you're setting the time and you're twisting and pulling in, or you're screwing the case back on. You don't want the movement rocking in any particular direction, particularly whenever you're securing the case back on. So what I'll do on the movement holder designs is I will put in notches that will fit into those recesses, those locations. Of course, the reason for this is to help keep it from twisting. So I've got 2 of those on this holder at about the 4 and the 9 o'clock locations. You can see there's the notch for the side of the case. It's got little tabs I put on top to just give something to really press against the case back as it gets screwed down and keep it secure, and they'll compress a little bit if needed, if it's just a little bit too tall. Sometimes on the interior, I'll bring the height up to the same height as the main bridge, main plate of the watch movement. That's kind of what I've done here. Something else I decided to do on this one, since there's nothing sitting over the top of the movement. Now imagine this from just a functional standpoint. I've got the stem in here. I've put the holder in like so. Now the movement is secured to the dial, so it'll stay down in place. These notches help keep it from twisting, but I still like having a little bit of security on the top, a little tab or something, that if I had the stem in here and I pushed down on it a little bit, it wouldn't move the movement up away from the dial. And so what I've done on this movement holder is I've put a couple of tabs on the top here next to where the movement is sitting, and you can see, I'll show the drawing too, or the visualization on the computer for this. There are little tabs here, not very thick. I think they're only like 0.5 millimeter thick or something like that. Little tabs that rest against the top of the movement. There are 2 of them on here, one at about 10 o'clock, the other one down here at about 7 o'clock. And these rest against the movement in locations that were, I just chose that were good selections. So there's nothing crazy going on that this is going to interfere with down here around 7 o'clock. And then the same thing up here at 10 o'clock. Some whole locations you would want to avoid if you were going to do this in certain spots, or you don't want to get too close to, for example, the balance wheel. So just choosing the right locations to put those little tabs. So that was the next big step, custom movement holder. Starting to look good though, right? Another thing I've been considering with this project is there an appropriate place to put my 10.6 logo that lets people know that this modification, this watch really was my work in terms of putting it all together. Again, the only thing from the original was the dial and the hands, but I don't know that I will. It'd have to go somewhere here on the back. Probably I don't think I'd want to put it on the dial side, but there might be somewhere here where I could work it in, but I don't think I'm going to do that initially. All right, so the next thing I had to think about was a stem. I've put this movement in a case that's bigger than a lot of the cases probably used for this movement, and the default stem that comes with the Miyota 6T33 is, its part number is 065117. That's the default stem. It's just not long enough for this particular case, and so I had to make a custom stem. Now you might think, well, why don't you just put an extender on the original stem, get it trimmed, sized up right, and there you go. 2 considerations with that. I tried to avoid extenders if I can. Couldn't in this case, but it's not a huge deal. You can use Loctite and it'll function just as well as a stem without an extender. But first thing I looked for was a stem that fit the Miyota 6T33 that was a little longer stem. They do make that part. It's the 065489. Problem is, not that many of those stems were probably made. Usually people stick with the default stem length. So I scoured the web, seeing if any watch distributors, eBay, you name it, I looked everywhere, and nobody had the longer stem. So we're back to the idea of using an extender. The hiccup with that is that the original stem that comes with these movements from the factory is not threaded the whole way, just the end for the crown. The rest of it is smooth, so it's not fully threaded. Okay, so here's the stem that came with the movement from the factory. Screw an extender on here, and then trim the extender, which is threaded, down as far as it needs to go to fit the case and movement. But with this whole combination of things, there was an issue. I only need to extend this a couple of millimeters. Notice on the extender, the first couple millimeters are this tube, basically the female end that's threaded on the inside so you can attach the stem to it. Well, if I put an extender on this, so imagine me putting the extender on, so screwing that in, there's where it is. To get this to be the right length for this case, I would have had to trim almost down into the tube of the extender, which would leave no threads for the crown. So I couldn't use the stem that came with the movement because what I needed was a fully threaded stem so I could trim this down further so that when I put the extender on, I had room for threads for the crown. I mean, it was just like this, like one little thing after I was like, okay, I can't put an extender on the original stem that came with the movement because it doesn't leave enough threads for the crown. And this is something that I hadn't thought about before, but someone pointed out to me in a Facebook group, which was a helpful insight, is that the factory stems are not threaded all the way. But if you buy the stems, you know, in not necessarily in bulk, but if you buy them, I want to say aftermarket, that come from the manufacturer, but those stems that you buy separate from the movement are fully threaded. And so that's what I have here, is I bought several of those. You can see this is threaded all the way down. So I trimmed a reasonable amount off of this threaded stem, put the extender on, plenty of threads for the crown, and now it fits into the movement at the right distance just fine and will snap in all the way. And at that point, it's just getting the case back on, screwing it down, picking the right strap for this thing, and we have got a fun little mod. I think it's going to just give a wonderful different feel to this watch, having the sweeping motion of the seconds hand as opposed to the quartz, you know, ticking dead seconds. So now we got all the components and the sizes and the parts all figured out. Now we just have to actually put it together. As always, thanks for my subscribers and thanks for joining me. Consider subscribing if you haven't, and then hit the bell if you want updates. I hope that the informational videos like this, that talking through issues you're going to come across, things you have to consider when you're doing watch modding or making a custom watch build of some sort, that aren't just like kits that you are made to go together or a movement meant to go in a specific case, so it's already got the holder done for it. But if you want to branch out and get a little bit more variation and kind of do your own thing, informational video like this one gives a lot of that context. And in the next one, we're going to get to take all those components we've worked hard to get or make and put them all together in their final state and have this pretty fun watch completed. And that's going to be fun seeing that secondhand sweeping around on this watch. More watch content can be found on my site, watchcomplications.com. Links to that and my Instagram are in the description below. I'm Brian, I'm out.